Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We recently put out a TikTok that has been doing very, very well. So shout out to everybody who's been interacting with that. Our YouTube short has hit a huge bounce back as well. We're back live. This is a live discussion about, talking about a couple of things. We have an elimination, and then we also have a game 5 that just occurred, and we see some people are a little bit active in the chat. We love the energy that's going on here, but we ask that you do please keep it respectful. Regardless of what's going on. I know basketball can get toxic, but please let's try and keep it respectful. But we do understand, everybody does have their viewpoints and all that stuff, and everybody can voice their opinions. Before we do get started with this live discussion, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you are new, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so I guess, it's been a while since we did a live stream,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
I think the last time we did one was, what was it, game 1, I think, of, the second rounds.
Yes, sir.
So it's been a while, but now we got an elimination. So we'll get into that. Obviously, we'll get into the other games, seeding those as well. But the first one we'll touch is Boston, Cleveland, right? So obviously that series is over.
Yes, sir.
Right? Boston ended up winning in 5, 113-98 in this game 5. Pretty much what we expected, right? Going into the series, we already knew Cleveland was down, Jared Allen. Then it gets worse, right? Then Donovan Mitchell goes down. Karis LeVert's down. Not that he's in the same tier of importance as them, but it's, again, when you're already shorthanded, can't risk missing more guys. So, at the end of the day, Boston, even if Cleveland was healthy, would have won, right? Like Boston's the better team, even without Porzingis. The main issue for Cleveland is that, they can't really guard Boston that effectively for the most part, right? Like Boston at different points, other than, like a couple of stretches when the games would be close, could kind of get whatever they wanted. In this game, Horford had a bounce back game. Kind of interesting to see where that goes from here, right? Because he was, not shooting the ball very well, as the starting big. But, obviously they needed him and he bounced back, right? He was basically their best player. But, for Boston, they move on to the conference finals. They await the winner of, the Knicks-Pacers series, right? Which is 3-2. We'll get into that later on. But, again, with Boston, they continue to show why they are a dangerous team and, the favorites to come out of the East. Obviously, yeah, they've gotten a lot of breaks in terms of the injuries. Chill, they sucked this game, and you know it if you were real. Okay, all right. I forgot that.
They're still beefing. We'll get to that game soon, though. Just bear with us. We do have to talk about this elimination. It is very important.
But yeah, so for Boston, yeah, they move on. And again, you did what you needed to do in this series, right? You needed to make sure that it didn't go longer than 5,
right?
And that nobody else got hurt in the process, right? Obviously, there were times where it got pretty rocky. Some of those, second halves were a little bit ugly, but then usually they were able to kind of just pull away late in the game, which is what you'd expect, right? Like, obviously, if they want to win the title, they're going to have to play better. They'll be playing better teams down the road, but pretty much you got what you needed to get out of the Celtics, in order to win this series.
Yeah, and, looking back on this series, like you talked about, it was pretty much a walking mismatch, I think, from all aspects in terms of, Boston versus Cleveland. You look at it, there's just times where the wing depth was just not there for Cleveland. Clearly, Isaac Okoro, he was a guy who kind of was tasked with guarding some of the wings, and, he just really couldn't keep up. And Jared Allen being out definitely did not help, because then you had to bring in a guy like Dean Wade, who's really good on the perimeter, but outside of that, what can he really bring to the table? Alongside the fact that Darius Garland struggled this entire series, and that's kind of something that we are going to talk about as well. But, him not being the best version of himself definitely hurt this squad to the maximum. You could really tell, because there were times like it was just the Donovan Mitchell show, and that even happened in the previous series where it really just felt like Donovan Mitchell versus the world, and that's kind of what Cleveland's offense had been relegated to during this series. And even like a guy like Evan Mobley, he had a great game this go around, but previously you looked at him and you were kind of weary of his offense because it just didn't look solid. And I was talking to my friend, because he's a Boston fan, and he acknowledged like Evan Mobley has all the potential. It's just sometimes he makes it look and be a little bit harder than it needs to be, because he has a clear size mismatch on certain guys, but, it just didn't really work out. But at least in this game, he did kind of flash I guess, some promise where you look at him and you're like, okay, if he is the number 2 option on a team, maybe he could really be, all that he was touted to be coming out of high school and college. But, enough on because basketball is a team sport, not individual. But, this Cleveland team, it needs some work. We clearly knew that they had a strong ceiling. I think they had a great floor, but their ceiling was just really really low, where it's to the point like they probably weren't going to get past Boston. That was probably their ceiling. They just barely squeezed out against Orlando, and I feel like if that was probably even like a different team instead of Orlando, they probably would have lost that series. So I think they need to improve a lot. But this was a nasty series, I think, from Boston or from the Cleveland's perspective. But if you're Boston, you did everything that you were supposed to do except for win game 2, which is something that they've struggled with. Everybody played well for Boston. You had kind of like some interesting moments where Al Horford turning back the clock. Tatum played pretty dang good. Once again, Drew Holiday showed up. Derek White showed up once again. The only guy who probably didn't do too much was Jaylen Brown, but you didn't really need it just because Cleveland was on like one leg this entire series pretty much. Peyton Pritchard coming off the bench doing his normal thing. So overall, great job from Boston and Cleveland. We have to talk about their offseason because this is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. From Boston's perspective, they did everything they needed to do. They
Mm-hmm.
turned it up defensively when it was time, and like guys that were kind of inconsistent at different points, they were able to lock in and start playing better, right? Like Derek White had a few bad early games, and then he was able to figure his shot out after a while. Right, same with the other guys. So not really too many complaints, because again, the goal for them is get out of the series healthy and relatively quickly. But back to Cleveland, yeah, there's a lot of questions now. To be honest, these were questions that you were already thinking about even after beating Orlando. It just, getting to the second round kind of delayed some of the topics. I
Mm-hmm.
think Mobley over the course of the series played a lot better. I think, because again, like early on, even early in the first round, right, there were moments where it didn't look great. But I think after a while, they made the offense a lot simpler for him, where it wasn't just him trying to post up or shoot threes, right? It was a lot more pick and roll, right? It was a lot more he can face up and kind of drive and attack. And so I think you feel a lot better about Evan Mobley than you probably would have, right? Especially like if, again, assuming that you have to decide between him and Jared Allen. Like Allen right now is probably the better player, but Mobley has more upside. And it just, I don't think that those two guys can probably coexist together. But the real question, I guess, you got two, right? You have Garland and you have Mitchell, right? This guy, LOL, can't wait for it to be relevant.
It's still
You-
beefing, bro.
these are some good discussions that we
Yeah.
got going on in the chat. But with Garland and Mitchell, right? Um, the thing with Garland is last year, he was pretty good. But this season, it was a lot of more up and down. To be fair, he had the jaw injury, right? And obviously that can make a difference.
Yeah.
You wonder if he can really coexist with Mitchell. But with Mitchell being out, right, then there's not really much of an excuse for him to do, what he can do. Obviously, the defense is more locked in on him, so that, the job becomes a lot tougher. But you can kind of see that there's some limitations there, right? Like, obviously, he can shoot, he can drive to the basket, but, he's got to still probably work on some of the in between stuff, right? Like, there's possessions where trying to get past Al Horford, and yeah, that didn't necessarily work, right? Horford's a strong guy, but he's not that quick, right? He's got the
Right.
speed to get past him, but then he can't really finish like around him. He has to kind of try to go through him.
Yeah.
And, again, so the strength, maybe if he didn't lose all that weight, from the jaw injury, maybe he'd be a little bit stronger, but he's making a lot of money now, right? So he's going to have to continue to improve. And then obviously with Mitchell, right? What do you do with him, right? Because he's obviously got that player option at the end of next season, right? You got to decide if you're Cleveland, and you have to decide if you're Mitchell. Do you want to re-sign and stay, right? Because with Cleveland, like you said, the ceiling is not super high, right? Like this is probably not a team that can realistically come out of the East because you just don't have enough in certain spots. And it's going to only be harder because once you pay everybody, then you can't really improve as well, right? Because then you haven't even paid Evan Mobley yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? Isaac Toro, what do you do with him? Do you keep him, right? He's in year 4. So it's either the qualifying offer, resigns, or he walks.
Right.
So we don't know what they do there. Obviously, they put out, some multiple they put out multiple pieces about Cleveland after they got eliminated, right? You had one talking about, JB Bickerstaff, the coach, right? What's his future like? You know, probably gone, but who knows, right? Maybe he stays, but I don't know. It feels like he's probably going to get canned. But we'll see. And then obviously the other questions, right? They asked about Mitchell and Garland, right? Because the thought process was that there's a scenario where if Mitchell signs an extension, it's very possible that Darius Garland might might look to get out of there, right? Because I guess you can kind of look at it from the perspective of they probably just can't go coexist. They're probably going to get in each other's way because they both need the ball. But now that Garland's making a ton of money, right? I guess my question would be which team would be interested in in trading for him and giving up pieces to acquire him. But this could also be determined by okay, if Mitchell's like, I'm not signing the extension, then you have to trade him, right? And there have been talks about different teams that would be interested. I think they mentioned the Heat, the Rockets,
Hmm.
the Brooklyn Nets, the
Hmm.
Lakers. So there's a lot of options there. Cleveland, my guess is that they would like to re-sign him and bring him back. But obviously, again, a lot of it's going to be based off what Mitchell wants, right? He played well in the series when he was healthy, but then he got hurt, missed a lot of time during the regular season. Clearly, he's obviously very good. It's just if you're Mitchell, you know, and you want to go further than the second round, it's probably not going to be with this team. So, I guess the question is, are you okay with that? Or would you rather, go somewhere else? I don't know, right? Because
Right.
there's been a lot of stuff about that he probably won't stay long term. I don't think this playoff run really changes that either way. Like, if you were going to ask me, like, what my guess is, I think he would probably not resign and they might have to move him. Could be completely wrong, but, there's a lot of questions. And then even for also Jared Allen, right? Because you're going to have to pay Evan Mobley, right? And I don't think those two guys can fit together. Both guys are good players. They just can't play together at the same time because they do kind of a lot of the same stuff, right? Neither guy can really shoot that well. Both of them are probably better operating like, in the middle around the basket, right? So that's kind of a question that you have. Um, if you're another team, I think there's a lot of teams that would like to trade for Jared Allen. So, if you're one of those other teams, what do you give up to get him? I don't know. So if you're Cleveland, there's a lot of questions that are going to have to be answered. But again, those questions were questions that you would have asked anyways, right? Because again, they weren't getting past Boston. They were very close to losing to Orlando. So I mean, that's kind of something that you have to factor in here. But from Cleveland's perspective, probably going to be a relatively long offseason. I think think Mobley showed promise. Garland took a step back, but maybe if you move Mitchell, bring in some other pieces, maybe you might like some of the younger guys better, or maybe you want to keep Mitchell and then move a couple of those young guys. We'll see what direction they take. But, this Cleveland's been a little bit unpredictable, right? Because the initial trade for Donovan Mitchell was kind of unexpected, right? A lot of people thought it was going to be the Knicks, and they kind of swooped in, gave up a lot of stuff to get him, right? It was multiple picks, pick swaps, Laurie Markkinen, Colin Sexton, and I think, what was it, Ochai Agbaji. But, since then, first round exit, and then you won one playoff series, and then you lost the next one in five. So, I mean, you basically won what? I guess 6 playoff games in 2 years. Cavs should trade Spida according to the Homelander. So, I mean, that's what I would. I mean, I think they would if you were asking Cleveland what they would like to do. I don't know, like based off of how they would have operated, they would probably prefer to just re-sign Mitchell, bring him back. But again, if he's not going to stay, you have to trade him. And I just
Hmm.
don't know if he's going to stay. But I don't know what he wants because again, maybe he likes, kind of being the guy because if he gets moved to somewhere else, a couple of those spots, it won't be his team,
Right.
right? Some of them they will, right? Like Brooklyn, it'll be his team. It'll be his team probably in Houston, right? Miami, maybe depending on who goes out, like but I mean, who's going out? I don't
Right.
know. And then the Lakers, not going to be his team either. So I mean, there's a lot of options there, but yeah, this is weird for Cleveland at this point. But again, not really unexpected. I mean, like,
Hmm.
I don't, this was a team that I think I don't want to say that we were calling them fraudulent, but this was a team that I don't think we expected to make a deep playoff run. Like, obviously, yeah, it's nice they got out of the first round, but we didn't expect much more than that.
Yeah, we learned our lesson from last year. I think it on paper the roster looks great, but if you really sit down and watched a lot of Cleveland basketball this season, you could tell they struggled a lot in certain areas. And also, granted, health was not on their side at all during the season. They had stretches where guys were in and out for long periods of time, and that clearly affected the chemistry. I think. So maybe they try and run it back. I don't know, but with all the pieces coming out, it does spell. You know that something's going to give and something's going to change. The one that kind of threw me off was definitely the Garland thing. I didn't expect Garland to kind of come up in trade rumors like immediately after the game was over. That was kind of wild. But I think that does beg the question of, they kind of have to choose between, Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell, which I think is a tough choice because you look at it, Darius Garland has a lot of potential, but you already know that Donovan Mitchell is that guy. Like, what he can be. It's just, can he lead a team to a championship? Because at the end of the day, the end goal is a championship. Then I think you have to also kind of potentially look at Evan Mobley versus Jared Allen. Obviously, they're going to pick Evan Mobley, but what do you do
I
with
would.
Jared Allen? Because I think Evan Mobley has a lot of potential. We saw it throughout both of these playoff series and whatnot. And it's kind of funny. I was reading up on Evan Mobley and stuff a little bit before we went live, and I didn't know that he tried to, or not he, but his representation cautioned the Cavs prior to the draft not to pick him, which is kind of interesting. And I know it's a pretty common strategy or whatever to get to certain teams, but now we're looking at kind of Cleveland having some roster woes, which is, like you said, not unexpected, but now that we're kind of talking about it, I think they're in a sticky situation because you have to make some serious choices. And I think, we also do have to talk about Bickerstaff, who's their coach. He's 45, under contract through 2026 and makes roughly $5 million a year, but hasn't really been all that successful with this Cleveland team. If you want me to be honest, we've seen them have a couple of playoff stints, but nothing's really come out of it. And you just feel like you're kind of wasting money, talent, and opportunities. I think, with the way that the team is played, I don't think he's like a horrible coach, but I just don't think he's maximized these guys to the maximum ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's just yeah, I mean that's kind of at the end of the day, yeah. Sometimes you just kind of need a different voice in there, and that's probably what's gonna have to happen. I mean, because again, it's just like and again, it's a rough spot because it's kind of hard to maximize Mobley when you got guys that don't really fit together. But
Sure.
at the same time, when you're the head coach, you kind of have to find ways to make it work. And again, there were other tidbits in the article, which again, kind of makes me feel like that they might trade Allen. Like I think they mentioned that he refused an injection, right? Like a cortisone injection or whatever to kind of try to play through the injury, right? So maybe that kind of sours the relationship a little bit. You know, maybe we'll see.
Yeah.
But either way, yeah, like not really super unexpected to me from Cleveland. And this is a team that's probably going to look different by the time next season rolls around. Like, I don't know who's gone, but I think there's a good chance that at least one of Allen or Mitchell is gone.
Yeah. And
Maybe Garland, but we'll see.
yeah, and I'm just very curious because I think it does open up a completely new market. Like you were talking about, though, Garland does make a crap ton of money, but I think it does put another point guard kind of on the market where a team with a lot of wiggle room to kind of pick up one of these guys could potentially, give up a little bit of assets to Cleveland. But we'll see. It all comes down to what Cleveland wants to do because do they want to keep Donovan Mitchell or do they want to get rid of Garland? But regardless, I think, coming out of this series, I think the best thing that you can kind of look forward to is really the Eastern Conference Finals for the Celtics. So they're kind of just waiting for their opponent, which will either be decided, I believe, when is the next game? Is it tomorrow?
I think it's Friday, right?
Okay,
And then
yeah.
I think if there's a game 7, it's Sunday.
Okay, yeah. So on either of those dates, they'll find out who their next opponent is. But yeah, congrats to the Celtics for going back to the Eastern Conference Finals once again. And yeah, they this is kind of like their third time, third in a row. So this is kind of like become their staple. But the problem is, can they actually win the big trophy? We'll see. But I guess our next game that we do have to talk about is Oklahoma City versus Dallas.
Yeah.
Game 5,
Yeah.
wild one, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into this one. So, obviously, this was a series where I think, we picked Oklahoma City,
Hmm.
but we did say 7, so, it's kind of a coin flip.
Hmm.
But some of it was predicated on in the first round. It didn't seem like Luka was quite right physically. Obviously OKC having support, but again, in terms of how this series has gone, right? Like you give a lot of credit to Dallas, right? They've been a really good defensive team over the course of, the trade deadline, right? The pieces that they picked up, PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, right? Even a guy who was there at the beginning of the season, like Derek Jones Jr., where we're initially like, oh, wow, that's kind of a weird, player to put in the starting five. But then he shot well from three over the course of the year, plays really good defense, obviously kind of a cheat code in terms of the lobs, running the floor, even shot blocking from the wing spot, just giving them athleticism that they have never really had next to Luca, and obviously him and Kyrie as well. But you know, obviously, if you're OKC, it kind of hurts, right? Because in the games that they lost, they were kind of in all of these games. Obviously, this one, I think the lead went up to as much as 18. But this one kind of went a similar way where it's like, Dallas kind of took away the rim for OKC on offense and kind of turned them into, okay, if you're going to beat us, you're going to beat us by knocking down a ton of threes. And OKC was the number one 3-point shooting team during the regular season, right? But in some of these games, they have not shot very well, right? Like in this game, they were 10 for 40, which is just, not going to be able to get it done, right? Like, Shea, he was, really the only guy who was pretty good for most of the game. He didn't have enough help, right? You look around, Jalen Williams was 6 of 13, 0 of 3 from three, but, some of that was when the game was kind of already probably decided, right? Like Lou Dort was 4 of 11, 2 of 8 from three. Chet Holmgren, 5 of 11, 1 of 5 from three. They changed the starting five, right? They put Isaiah Joe out there instead of Josh Giddey, and then he proceeded to shoot worse than Josh Giddey, right? He
Right.
was 2 for 9, 2 of 8 from three. They did generate a lot of good looks from three, but again, that's where it's kind of maddening if you're a team like Oklahoma City because you're watching PJ Washington on the other end, right? He had 2 or 3 other games where he couldn't miss right on his open looks. Even in this game, right? He didn't shoot as well, 2 for 7, but then Derek Jones Jr. comes in and is 3 for 5, right? And then Luca obviously has a huge bounce back game, which is another, differentiator as well, right? Because he wasn't great. So frustrating to watch, man. WTF. And that's the tough part of a playoff series is that sometimes these series can swing based off of just crazy performances, right? Like last year, we watched some playoff series where it was like, what was it against the Grizzlies, right? Like Rui Hachimura makes like every single, open three,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like, you watch the Denver series, in some of those series in the playoffs last year where those guys are just hitting tough shot after tough shot. And sometimes that can swing games and series. So that's the tough part, with a team like OKC, some of these guys, are kind of showing the inexperience. But, again, like the threes are high quality looks for the most part. Some of them is, Dallas playing really good defense. Like there was this possession. Let's see, Derek Jones Jr. and PJ Washington turning into all stars was not on my radar. And that's the tough part where it's such a gamble defensively, where we talked about it um, on our regular episodes that weren't live streams, where, do you leave a guy wide open? Right. So leaving a guy like PJ Washington or Derek Jones Jr. open so that way you can kind of trap and double and blitz Luca or Kyrie. There's a gamble to it because if those guys hit those shots and they go in, they're going to make you pay over the course of a 7-game series. Because you had a couple of games where Kyrie and Luca weren't even that great,
Right.
and they ended up winning because PJ Washington and, like he mentioned, Derek Jones Jr. hit those shots. But then if you decide to close out, then that means way more opportunities for the Dallas Stars, right? With the ball in their hands, whether or not it's lobs to the bigs or those guys just going one-on-one and kind of just taking advantage of the matchups. And again, those type of performances can swing series, right? If Isaiah Joe shoots, in this game like he did for most of the regular season, right? They might have had a chance, to win that game, win this game or one of the other couple of games, but it's tough. And then even a guy like a Josh Giddey, right? He just hadn't been great in this series, right? He, played in 11 minutes, 5 of 8 from the field, 1 of 3 from three. But, the reason why he was moved to the bench was because, couldn't really help them. Right. Because in those previous games, a lot of the offense was kind of, forced into him, where instead of SGA taking some shots or Chet or, Jalen Williams, it's Josh Giddey, right? It's the Josh Giddey show. And it's not his fault, right? Because when you're open, you kind of have to take those shots. But it was just mucking up the offense. And you could kind of see the idea of like, okay, we'll bring him off the bench and have him run some backup point guard. But like I said, when you make adjustments like that, better work, right? And again, the thought process makes sense, right? Put Isaiah Joe in, who doesn't need the ball, who's a really good 3-point shooter, but he just couldn't knock him down. And that's the tough part. J Dub needs to wake up. SGA cannot do it alone. And that's the tough part is that, SGA is already there. We're like, we already know he's a superstar.
Yeah.
Obviously this is his first superstar postseason, right? Because he was in the playoffs, in the bubble, right? But he wasn't the same guy. But we can already see, he's been pretty good, really good actually in these playoffs.
Yes.
But like the Homelander said, you know, it's a team. So you need your other guys to show up and play well. I'm not going to put the blame on him. When other guys just can't hit shots for the most part. But, that's kind of what these series come down to. So, we know what happens where, game 5 is a swing game because we know the winner of game 5 goes on to win the series 85% of the time. And obviously, it's huge if you win it on the road. So this one feels like it's probably done. Obviously, we'll see what OKC does, going back to Dallas in game 6 because they were able to steal game 4 in Dallas. But if they're going to win this series, they're going to need these guys to play better and they're going to have to respond because if it just turns into SGA playing 1-on-5, they have no chance because Dallas has enough role players around Luka and Kyrie that all you just need is a decent game from those guys, and they're probably going to be able to pull it out.
Yeah. And Homelander, are you worried at all, or are you like you're like set on OKC in 7, or are you just kind of like giving up on this? But my takeaway from this game for sure, Luka showed up, and it kind of felt like the Dallas Mavericks of old a little bit, but also with defense, because it was more of like a Luka show, and then everybody else kind of just filed in and made their shots when they needed to, i.e. like PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr. But I do want to highlight the bigs too, because I think they played phenomenal. They've been some high energy guys. They've been doing everything. And like you were talking about, they shut down the paint completely. I mean, that wall is something serious. Like, the only guys who can really get in there are guys that will kind of catch them off guard, who aren't the best, finishers around the rim. When they do get there, that's kind of the only time that OKC can really get some paint buckets. But yeah, Gafford and Derek Lively, they've been amazing. I think on the boards, shot blocking, and just from a rim protection aspect, and also offensively as well. I've seen some crazy lob catches from them. They've been, in the right place at the right time, and that's kind of what we talked about when they first got acquired. In Gafford, that is really, he's another lob threat that can do pretty much the same things as Derek Lively, just a little bit different kind of physicality in terms of builds and stuff like that. But if you're OKC, I don't know what you do from here. Like you talked about, I think it's over. I'm for sure worried. Like I said, I don't know about the Homelander, but I don't know what you do because, they've tried everything. They've kind of tried to limit guys like PJ Washington, give him less open shots. But then when you do that, Luke has a game like this. I will say, I think they've done a good job kind of taking Kyrie out of the game, limiting him a little bit. But at the end of the day, he's still doing his job, getting the assists, playmaking, and hitting his shots at the right time because we already know he's clutch as well. But I just think they're kind of getting out-experienced, out-manned, out-hustled, and definitely outshot, which is not something that I expected. I thought, OKC would come out firing, but Dallas has showed up, and that's crazy because it all comes back to the complementary players, which is definitely something we talked about multiple times on the podcast. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's over. If you want me to be real, I think, it's done probably. And, it might have been a premature pick just based on the fact that Luka didn't look too good in the previous series. But now he's for sure healthy. He's bubbly, too. He's actually, like, laughing it up with certain guys on the court and the audience as well, or, attendees and stuff. But it's not looking too good if you're an Oklahoma City fan. So I'm worried. Yeah, figured.
I mean,
It's
at this
bad.
point, yeah, at this point, you kind of have to be because, again, it's just like if you can't get those easy paint buckets like Dallas can, then that means you don't have a choice but to shoot, crazy percentages from 3. And that just doesn't always happen in the playoffs. But, again, Dallas shot 40% from 3 tonight. They got a lot of quality looks from 3, but then they also got a ton of really good looks at the rim. So And again, that's where it's really tough. How are they shutting us down?
It's
I
that
mean,
wall.
yeah, it really comes down to the fact that a guy like a Gafford, even though, he people don't, know as much about him, but he's a big guy, even though he's not super tall, but he's physical, he's a good athlete. And he
The
makes it tough, right?
landlord.
Yeah, exactly. PJ Washington, not super tall, right? But he is a physical guy, he's a decent athlete. Um, Derek Jones Jr. as well, right? Like, really, they're taking away the rim. So it's like, because if you look at the threes they're getting, not all of them are bad shots. Like, there's a lot of good quality threes, but it's kind of like it gets to a point where, like, like last year, um, when it was, what was it, Lakers Golden State, right? Like, the Lakers took away the rim for Golden State, right? Like, they couldn't get there. And he said, I knew it was over when Luca blocked the SGA. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was definitely different physically tonight compared to the previous game where he was,
100%.
grabbing at his, leg or knee or whatever every other possession. In this one, he
Yeah.
looked a lot more lively and didn't even complain to the refs for most of the game, which,
There was
is a big
one possession. It was
one. There was
hilarious.
one.
Did you
There
see
was
it?
one.
Did you see it where he was like at the top of the key? He wasn't even looking at the play. He was looking at the ref the entire time because Dort was like holding his arm or whatever, and he's like, "Can you like get this guy off of me or whatever?" But I think that's
Yeah,
like a sign that Luca's a-okay, in the body and definitely in the head because he normally wouldn't be like joking around like that. I feel like if he wasn't healthy.
right. But going back to how are they shutting us down, it's really just they're taking away the rim and they're just forcing them, to the paint or to the perimeter where it's like, the only good shots that they're going to get are from three. And over the course of a playoff series, like, guys are going to get fatigued. Guys are probably going to start getting nervous as well, right? And again, like, the thing is that there are certain guys where you're okay with them shooting threes, right? Like, you're okay with, like a Josh Giddey shooting threes, or like, Jay Lynn Williams, the big, he shot what, like close to 40%. Their bigs are better, TBH. That's the other difference. At the very least, they're better in terms of physicality and just kind of all around play. Because really, for OKC, it's really just Chet.
Yeah.
Right after that, and they don't really have anybody else, other than, I guess, Jay Lynn Williams. And again, that's just not enough from a front court standpoint. And you could deal with it if you were out shooting them from three. But again, that's kind of hard to do because, again, like I mentioned last year with Golden State and LA, Golden State tried to get Anthony Davis out onto the perimeter so that way they could get some easy shots at the rim. Because anytime he was around the basket, they could not get anything, and that forced them into taking a lot of long, tough threes. Even if they're open, at a certain point, those shots are going to stop falling. And that's where you give a lot of credit to Dallas defensively in terms of the bigs and the athletes. And they're just kind of running away with it at this point. But yeah, when you mentioned their bigs are better, yeah, that's a swing point because if Oklahoma City's front court, right, like Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren, both Jalen Williams, honestly, if those guys play better, that's a swing. But when PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford are going to outplay OKC's front court, it's not really a whole lot you can do there. It was a good run, boys. Game over. And I think, and obviously we'll, get more into it when it's over. But I think there would be a significantly worse feeling if it was like if Dallas lost the series than Oklahoma City.
Oh,
Because I think you have to
100%.
look at it from the perspective of, if you're Oklahoma City, you have a bright future because you have a lot of picks, you have a lot of good young players. Presumably those guys are going to get better. Whichever guys you don't want to keep, you can probably trade with picks and bring in somebody else. With Dallas, this is kind of, as good as it gets, like, in terms of, like, they've given up picks to bring in these role players. So, obviously they're still a really good team, but they don't have as many more assets to continue to improve the team. Now it's kind of up to Luca, to continue to do what he does, and the role players around them to continue to play better, right? Like, say, we have a future, though we have the picks, just get rid of Hayward. I mean, he's an expiring anyways, so
Okay,
um
yeah.
that's going to free up cap. So that's how you would look at it, right? Like, if you lose this series, like, obviously, yeah, you're disappointed if you're OKC, but again, like, you're going forward, you're probably going to stay one of the top three teams in the Western Conference, for the next, I don't know, several seasons, right? Because I mean, like, again, like Minnesota, Denver, OKC, and then there's going to have to be some other teams that will get up there, but we have to see them get up there first, right? We don't know if they're actually there yet, but we already know these three teams so far are really good in the West. So that's how I would look at it, right? Like,
Yeah.
again, if they lose, like, you still had a great season, like I said, it would be significantly worse for Dallas if they lost in the second round. Obviously, they missed the playoffs last year. They did tank at the end of the season to get Derek Lively, which worked out great. But, with Luca, right, they're trying to win a championship now, within like the next couple of seasons,
Yeah.
especially with Kyrie, on the roster. They're already making win now moves. OKC, obviously they want to win, right? But they're not quite in the win now position yet. You have a guy in SGA who's ready to win now. You just have to find the pieces around him, to make everything fit. And
Right.
that's you already have the tough part solved in terms of getting the superstar. And it seems like you got three really good players that you drafted and others that are, really good, like Cason Wallace, and others. You just got to keep finding the guys and, move other guys around. Um, and you'll get there, right? So that's how I think you got to look at it. But obviously, we'll talk more about OKC's, offseason, assuming they lose this series.
Yeah, and like the number one takeaway for Oklahoma City throughout this entire postseason should be the experience. Now you've experienced it, and you
Yep.
can continue to build on that. It's never going to be like a an overnight process. It's not how it normally goes. It's never really been like that. It takes a few years. You got to get these guys acclimated to a playoff environment. And in order to succeed, sometimes you need to fail, and that's kind of the best way that you can really look at it from Oklahoma City's standpoint. But I do understand, a lot of people are saying never say never, but the statistics, the analytics, they're all on the Mavericks side. So we're definitely, I think, going to predict that the Mavericks are going to finish this one out.
Yeah, you got to get your battle scars first.
Yeah,
But once you get them, right, it provides a lot of valuable experience, right?
yeah,
Because again, we saw a team like Dallas, right? Their first couple of times in the playoffs went out in the first round, right? Then they went to the conference finals. Obviously, they missed the playoffs last year, and they might go to the conference finals again. So, even a team like Denver, glad we got the experience. That's the most important part. And
yes,
that's why, like say, last season, because there were a lot of people who thought at the deadline that maybe OKC should just kind of tank. Um, because they were a play-in team for pretty much all of last year. But the fact that they didn't tank and they went for it to try to get into the playoffs was huge because then that got them the experience going into this year. And now you have the playoff experience this year that should help you out for next year. So, like, I don't look at this season as a disappointment, right? Like, obviously, it would be pretty bad if they had gone out in the first round. They weren't going to. But again, this is not a normal progression for a young team. So, regardless of what happens in this series, you come out of it, I think, feeling pretty good if you're Oklahoma City.
yeah, for sure. Um,
Um,
so I guess now we do have a lot of
yeah,
time left on our clock.
yes.
So
So
we might as well look ahead. I think a little
yeah,
bit. And maybe we can also look a little bit behind as well because we'll probably be
yeah,
talking about some stuff that you guys haven't heard from us since our last episode. But yeah, let's look ahead to the upcoming games.
yeah. So we got tomorrow. We have a big game, right? And potential elimination game. So if it ends, there were so many bandwagons this year, but we will rule the NBA for the next 5 years. Yeah, OKC
I
is going
believe
to
it.
be one of OKC is going to be one of the top teams in the NBA over the course of the next several seasons. Because they got so many assets and they have some really good young players that are only going to get better. But looking ahead, yeah, Thursday, right? Got a big game, potential elimination game. So if that series ends, we'll do a live stream as well. But it's Denver, Minnesota. And the last time that we did a live stream, I believe the Nuggets were down 0-2. And we thought that series was pretty much done. We saw Denver win or lose game one in Denver. It was a competitive game, but Minnesota ended up outplaying them. But then in game two, they just absolutely decimated them. Game three, right, was a swing game. We didn't know what was going to happen. Obviously, Murray threw the heat pack. Probably should have been suspended, but it just wasn't going to happen. But they also won by 30 points, so it may not have mattered anyways. But then game four also happened, right, where since they went down 0-2, they've won these last three games pretty handedly, right? Where, Denver is insane. You guys got that right for sure. And it's hilarious because as insane as they've been, we thought the series was done, but our initial pick was the Nuggets winning the series. I thought 6, you thought 7.
Yeah.
But we basically both thought it would be a competitive series, and it didn't look like a competitive series. early on.
Hmm.
And a lot of these games have been pretty decisive victories. But since Denver went down 0-2, they've pretty much handled Minnesota every game. And
Yeah.
Minnesota just now looks out of sorts. Seems like Denver's kind of figured them out now, where now you can kind of see some of the weaknesses with the two bigs where they can't get back in transition. Some of the offense is kind of mucked up. You're relying on Edwards to be superhuman. Didn't have a very good game last game, right? They double teamed him. Obviously, Mike Conley got hurt. He missed the last game, so that, makes a difference. But
Hmm.
he's also old. So, sometimes you kind of have to, it's not really a shocker that a guy that's, this late into his career can't play every single playoff game. Because he's had an injury history, even though he's been relatively healthy the last couple of seasons. But either way, right? And also the series is flipped where now Jokic has kind of been the best player on the floor, right? Like
Yes.
the first two games, it was Edwards and Towns that were the two best, right? But since then, it's been Jokic, right? Obviously, you watched that last game, saw what happened, right? He got his third MVP, right? Was going pretty much right at the defensive player of the year every time. Gobert played pretty good defense, but sometimes there's just nothing you can do,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if you look at a lot of those clips, putting his hands up, right? He's getting into him, but it literally just didn't matter. And it
Jokic
didn't
has
matter.
insane touch, dude.
Yeah,
It's
and like it didn't
ridiculous.
matter. Yeah, and it didn't matter if Towns was guarding him. It didn't matter if Nas Reed was guarding him. He's figured it out. And with Denver figuring it out, now it feels like now it's flipped that the Nuggets are more than likely going to win the series, right? Maybe they don't win game 6. Maybe Minnesota pulls it out. I don't know. We'll see if Conley plays, but because maybe Edwards has a huge bounce back game. But if Jokic is going to be that dominant, right? Because it wasn't even a game where Jamal Murray played that well, right? It
No.
was really um Jokic, and then after that, Aaron Gordon. KCP had a huge bounce back game, obviously, and then the bench for Denver has honestly been, has outplayed Minnesota's bench, right? Like Minnesota's bench has not really been that great at all, right? Nas Reed has had some moments on offense, but he's just getting dogged on defense.
Yeah, we talked about that in our last episode.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, like none of the matchups defensively have worked against Jokic at this point. Again, he's the best player in the NBA, and sometimes there's no answer for the best player in the NBA. But either way, that's the brutal part for Minnesota because now what can you realistically do, in order to kind of turn this around, right? Maybe, Jokic has a bounce back bad performance, right? Where he doesn't play very good, or something. But like even Aaron Gordon, right? He's also kind of flipped the series around, right? Because he wasn't good early on, but since the 0-2 deficit, he's been a completely different guy, right? Where, they're putting him in different spots for sure, right? Because Denver's made a lot of adjustments, right? Like because Gobert was guarding Aaron Gordon. Basically, he wasn't guarding him at all, right? So he's roaming around on defense. But they were like, all right, but Denver just decided to put Aaron Gordon in a lot of different spots. He's not just camping around in the paint. He's also, bringing the ball up, right? He's also, sometimes in the corner, and he's actually hitting a lot more of his jumpers than he was, earlier in the postseason. Joker is on another level, and he was drafted during a Taco Bell commercial. Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah.
May not happen this time around since the draft is going to be 2 separate days.
Yeah.
Um, right? But either way, um, you give a lot of credit to the Nuggets because it looked like they were dead, looked like they were done, absolutely toast. Defending champs, back to back is hard, maybe gassed, maybe fatigued. Jamal Murray didn't look healthy, but they've completely turned it around. And as they've kind of made Minnesota look silly these last few games, where like they've been in these games in different stretches. But I think what was it? It was game 4, right? Where like they were down 15-16. They cut it to 7. And then in the last 20 seconds, they give up like 8 straight points. And it gave the Nuggets basically like a 12-point cushion for most of the game. They ended up winning by that margin. Um, and you can also kind of see decision making as well, right? Where like the Nuggets, in terms of their decision makers, it's a level above I think some of the ones for Minnesota outside of Edwards. And so feels like this is done. We'll see what happens if Denver pulls out in game 6. But obviously if they win either one of these games and they go on to the conference finals, I think that the next round might potentially be not quite as brutal. Because whoever they play, whether it's OKC or Dallas, they don't have quite as much size. Although those teams are, I think better, less clunky offensive teams. So they could, there could be a way where they just kind of outscore Denver. But either way, this series feels like it's done, and it feels more so like, all right, the Nuggets now have shown up. They've woken up. They've kind of shown us that they're the defending champs. We still got, a chance to go back to back and do something special. And you just give a lot of credit to them because it again, I it just felt like they were completely done the first two games. And again, the craziest part is they lost those two games at home. And I think only five teams in the NBA have come back from being down 2-0, losing the first home game, right? Because usually when you go down 2-0 and they're talking about how tough it is, usually you lose the first two road games, and then you're like, all right, we go back home, we win the home games, and then we move. But
Yeah.
you lose the first two home games, that's another level of just, pulling off something that's really difficult. So it puts the Nuggets back on track to possibly coming out of the West. But, obviously we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah.
But yeah, just kind of go through what you kind of have witnessed over the course of this turnaround because it's been pretty wild, I think, to see, over the course of these last few games.
Yeah, and it's like Denver's showing their basketball IQ. They're showing their championship pedigree for sure. And like you were talking about, the decision making is on a whole nother level. Like, Aaron Gordon's not doing anything stupid. Nothing crazy. Like, in contrast to a guy like Towns, where he's kind of like fouling, Jokic in areas where you shouldn't even be fouling the guy because he's not necessarily a threat,
Ball pressure at 94 or 75 feet.
Sure. And it's like, I think Denver has awakened. That's the way that we kind of framed it when we were talking about it. And you kind of look back when Denver was down 2-0 and the whole entire NBA world pretty much wrote them off, as you really should, because we've never really seen a championship team kind of get that rattled, I think, that easily and that quickly by a team that doesn't really have a lot of experience. Because you look on the Timberwolves, great players, but none of these guys are really winners. If you really think about it, they don't have a crap ton of experience, and most of the experience that they have had has been on very subpar or mediocre teams. So, it's going to work out in Minnesota's favor even if they do get eliminated, because I don't think a lot of people expect them to be here. I don't think a lot of people expected Anthony Edwards to show up on this stage the way that he has, but at the end of the day, it's kind of similar to Oklahoma City, where you're getting more experience. You get to do some adjustments with the roster potentially. But for Denver's, run, it continues. I think the legend of the Denver Nuggets literally continues. And I don't think a lot of people saw this one coming, and I think this kind of adds to their potency, because I don't think any other team could go down, 2-0 while losing both games at home and also rally to take the series lead. I think that's just insane. That shows you that they do have the best player in the NBA, and I think they're the best team in the NBA, not necessarily record-wise, but play style, what they do, the way they rally, the way they believe in each other, and also, they have guys that show up. Once again, Christian Brown showing up when he needs to, just like he did last year. He showed up in a huge way off the bench. Reggie Jackson, he's done it in spurts. And then other guys, they've bounced back, whether it be KCP, Aaron Gordon. Michael Porter Jr. has kind of cooled off, but I think, he'll be useful in the next series because you don't really need him in this one if Aaron Gordon's kind of taking his place.
Yeah, I was going to say, and other guys have stepped up, offensively to kind of replace the offensive production you would be looking for from him. And again, the bench is also huge as well, because we talked about it. Denver's bench has been one of the worst in the NBA for the most part, right? Now, obviously, like in this game when Jokic was off the floor, they weren't quite as good as they were in the previous two games. But when they have Jokic with the bench guys, that's actually been pretty effective, right? Where, these lineups where it's like Jokic, but not too much size around him. And they've kind of been able to just run away with it against Minnesota's second units, because Minnesota still goes big with the two bigs, in the second units. And then Denver, whenever they get stops, they get out and run. There's nothing they can do, right? How many times did we see a guy like a Christian Brown or a Jamal Murray or Aaron Gordon just get breakaway, layups or dunks, at different points in the game? I mean, even a guy like a Christian Brown, right, where we weren't quite sure, with an increased role, what it was going to look like. But all of a sudden he comes out, he's guarding Edwards, about as well as any of the other guys for Denver probably can, because he's really the only guy as a guard that can kind of match up with him physically and athletically.
Sure.
Right. Because like KCP is a decent athlete, but he's not quite as physical, but Brown's a lot stronger than him, and honestly, just more athletic. So
Yeah.
that
You
makes it
don't want to
tougher.
put that kind of pressure on Jamal Murray to guard a guy like
Yeah,
Anthony Edwards. It's just not
yeah,
logical.
and Denver's defense has also been a lot better these last few games, right, than it was the first couple of games. Um, so there's a lot to really like about what they're doing, and when the offense is clicking, not much Minnesota can do, right? Because Minnesota's not going to be able to win a back and forth offensive performance against the Nuggets. It's just not
Right.
going to happen because their offense is not on that level. Right? We know during the regular season they were the number one defensive team, but on offense, right, they were a below average offensive team, right? Like, barely. I think they were 16th in offensive rating. But, Denver, for the most part, has been, one of the best on both ends of the floor, especially in crunch time. Right now, we haven't had any crunch time moments in the last few games. We've had moments where they've gotten, kind of close, but, by and large, Denver's just kind of outclassed Minnesota these last 3 games. And I don't really see a reason for why it wouldn't continue. 2024 NBA champ Denver Nuggets. We'll
How I
see. Because
feel,
I think
bro.
We'll see, because I think the other thing that you got to factor in is if they do go on to win the championship, this would be a lot more impressive, I think, last year's run. Because I think, last year's run, when you think about it, right, nobody's calling it fraudulent or fluky, right? But compared to this year, where it's like, yeah, you win against the Lakers in the first round, but then you win against a much improved Minnesota team from last year, right? Then in the conference finals, you're going against, either Oklahoma City or Dallas. Then in the finals, you're not going to be going against the Heat. You'll probably be going against the Boston Celtics, right? Who won significantly more games than you during the regular season, and they're going to have home court, not you.
Yeah.
So
It all comes down to
obviously,
Porzingis being healthy, though, for Boston.
right? Yeah, and we still don't really have, I don't think, at this point, any updates on
No.
him. So if if he's not available, then that's a problem. But then you also have to factor in, even if he comes back, right? What position physically is he in? To really do much. But yeah, like a lot of this kind of started with, yeah, in game 3, right? Murray was getting booed, rightfully so. But he, he basically, quieted the crowd because he made every big shot. And then from that point on, right, everyone else, right, followed suit, right? Jokic, right, also kind of led the way as well, right? Because in the last game, he was super aggressive on offense. He was, again, much better, much improved on the defensive end, a lot more
Yes.
effort. Um, which is huge, right? Because if your best player is going to buy in like that, there's really no real excuse for anyone else, right? I think it was Aaron Gordon after the last game where he said, "Yeah, if our best player is going to be selfish like that, like there's no excuse for us to not be." So that's that's the tough part about the Nuggets is they also played together for the most part, right? Like there are moments when you watch Minnesota, it's like Gobert's got a lob and they don't really give it to him, right? Or he's got a mismatch, they don't really give it to him. It's not a great offensive player, but
You have to give
again,
it to him if there's a guard on him down low. Simple as that.
right. Or, like you mentioned, some of the Towns possessions where it's, elbows, offensive foul, right? Or ball pressure 90 feet from the basket, or again, even with the clunky offense, right? Like a guy like Jaden McDaniels, you need more out of him, right? He's getting paid a lot of money. He's a very good defender, but his offense is kind of shaky.
And it
And if
looks
he's not,
even worse without Conley on the floor. Like
yeah,
that was
yeah,
the real kicker, I think, was like, having Ant-Man and Nikhil Alexander-Walker kind of alternate between running the one. That's not ideal in my opinion.
right. And like Nikhil Alexander Walker, he hits some threes,
Sure.
right? But he doesn't offer the same stabilizing
No.
presence that Conley does. And just that's kind of a rough spot when, it's like we need Mike Conley. And that's not a shot or a diss at Mike Conley. It's just, again, he's so crucial to what they can do on the offensive end because when it gets kind of out of whack and they start turning the ball over, I mean, that's basically, a death sentence against the Nuggets. Because if you turn the ball over against them, they're going to score way more often than not. And
Yeah,
again, when Jokic is locked in like that, there's pretty much nothing you can do. I
for
mean, like
sure.
again, rewatch that game, watch all of his shots that went in, and tell
And
me
he was
what do you
doing some dunking.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
how you
tell me,
know he was locked in.
right, and tell me what you're supposed to do about that. Like that that's the tough part because
Yeah.
again, they were able to kind of shut him down the first couple of games, but now he's figured it out. And yeah, that one definitely feels like it's over.
Yeah, Jokic masterclass leads to the elimination of Minnesota. That's the way
Yeah.
that I would put it. He played great. And I think we have one more series to talk about.
Yep. We
And
got
then we'll wrap it up.
yeah, so we got the Knicks Pacers.
Yes, sir.
Um, and so this was one where, you know, it was kind of a toss up, right? Because we both picked the Knicks to win that series. Um, game 3, right? Obviously, OG gets hurt after during game 2. Game 3 is a back and forth. Andrew Nemhart hits a crazy 3. Felt like it was going to be pretty brutal for the Knicks because you lose. If you won game 3, you go up 3-0. Series is done no matter what, right? You just got to win 1 out of 4, right? And nobody's ever blown a 3-0 lead, right? Maybe there would have been a chance for them to blow it just because of the injuries, but um, I think you could feel good about being up 3-0 against this Pacers team. But Pacers win the Indiana games, they tie it up. Then the Knicks go into New York. Starting lineup change. Miles McBride starts in place of Precious Achiuwa, and the Knicks pretty much go in there and just stomp Indiana. And Indiana's, response was kind of bizarre because it just felt like, for a good chunk of the game, they were kind of just playing, tentative, especially Halliburton. I don't think he was good in that game at all. He was pretty quiet. Honestly, you almost forgot he was out there, where he just wasn't looking to score. Obviously, defensively, kind of hit or miss for the most part. Um, and it was weird because it felt like to me that the Knicks were probably done. But, I did give them a chance to, still pull it out. I don't like changing my picks personally. Fraud Burton. Um, I mean, that's what the Homelander says. I mean, we'll see. I mean, Indiana's kind of in a similar boat as some of these other teams where it's a young, inexperienced team. And it's just like, you got to get your battle scars, before you can really make deep runs. Obviously, like the Knicks, they've already been here before. Now, to be fair, there are some guys that have come in that were not on this Knicks team last year, right? Like DiVincenzo wasn't on this Knicks team last year, um, but he was on a title team, even though he, got hurt in the first round. And he was on the Warriors last year, so he had some playoff experience, and he played a lot for them.
Yeah.
OG Anunoby, he was on the Raptors, right? Didn't play during the title year because he was hurt, but he was still on the other teams that made, some runs at different
Mm-hmm.
points. Whereas with the Pacers, I mean, I guess Turner was in the playoffs before, right? But he's not their best player. It's Halliburton.
Siakam.
So um we'll see what Indiana does at home, right? Because obviously, none of these teams have won on the road yet. In the Knicks game, that was a pretty good game on both ends of the floor, right? They got every offensive rebound, which didn't happen in Indiana. Brunson was back, had a huge game, right? He had 44. Um, and then, you got Miles McBride coming in as a starter and playing great on both ends of the floor, allowing them to, even though they're smaller, they were playing faster and they were getting stops and hitting more shots. The offense wasn't mucked up with Achua out there in the starting 5. So, you know, maybe the Knicks pull it off. I mean, again, on the road, game 6, closeout, again, you feel like you probably trust the Knicks more in a big spot than Indiana. But Indiana could come back and have a big game at home, and then it goes to game 7. But game 7 is in New York. So, I mean, this is kind of a coin flip, toss up. Because, again, the Knicks, they played well enough to win in game 3, but then they were just awful in game 4.
Yeah.
So, to me, some of it is just going to be Brunson. How's he feeling going into this game? Right? Do we see a version of Brunson closer to game, you know, uh, uh, 6 or 5 or whatever? Or do we see one closer to what we saw, in games, game 4? So,
Right.
and then also some of the other supporting cast guys, right? Because DiVincenzo was great the first, 3, 4 games. But he's kind of quieted down since then. But then you're getting performances from other guys, right? Alec Burks comes out of nowhere and starts hitting shots. Or again, Miles McBride, has now had some bounce back performances. So, what do we think, for this one? Are the Knicks probably going to close this out? Do we still expect the Knicks to win the series? Or do we think that, maybe something weird happens and then they end up losing in game 7?
I think Knicks win the series. I think, they have a lot. They have a lot going for them. Hartenstein has been a monster. I think, this entire series in terms of the offensive rebounds and defensive rebounds, just being on the boards across all fronts. Brunson obviously doing his thing, kind of getting a resurgence performance from him, like you talked about where he's hitting 40 points. And then McBride stepping into the starting lineup. Great adjustment by Tibbs, I think. Josh Hart being out there, DiVincenzo. I think DiVincenzo is kind of like the X factor. He's the one I think who needs to really, really show up, because I think if you get a good game from DiVincenzo, like a really, really good game alongside Brunson, it's wraps. I don't think, anybody on the Pacers can really match that kind of energy. But I feel like the main reason that the Knicks really won this game was because of Brunson and what he was able to do, and also Alec Burks, who's a guy that came off the bench and just showed up out of nowhere. You know, we kind of thought that he wasn't really going to get a lot of PT, but yeah, he has showed up for sure. But for some reason, I just feel like they're going to lose Game 6 in Indiana. I just don't think they really have what it takes to win in that hostile environment because you look at it, the Pacers have played so well at home, just like the Knicks have played so well at home as well. So I think, you know, the Knicks will close it out in 7. That's kind of the way that I've been talking to people about it this entire week. I've been, you know, asked about it, and I was just saying, I think the Knicks will win it in 7. I just don't foresee them really being able to win in Indiana just because I think, you know, guys like off the bench for Indiana, like a TJ McConnell, he plays great at home. Halliburton plays better at home. And, you know, the rest of the starters will kind of follow suit, I think, based off of Halliburton and Siakam. And they're just going to be comfortable at home, and I just don't think the Knicks are going to really have what it takes to do that. But Knicks in 7.
Yeah, I think the Knicks will probably end up winning this. I feel like you would like to win Game 6 because, you know, unlike, you know, the last game, right, there's a pretty quick turnaround from Game 6 to 7, right? Because
Right.
Game 7 will be on Sunday, right? Game 6 is Friday, right? So you're basically talking about like a day and a half of rest, you know, before you got to go back to New York and
Uh-huh.
close it out, right? And because it's an early game as well, right? It's going to be at 3:30. So, you know, I think if you're the Knicks, you know, again, they're pretty banged up. You know, I know the Pacers don't have Matherin, you know, and I know there are a couple of guys like Halliburton and others that are dealing with stuff, but the Knicks have, you know, several important players out.
Yeah.
But they've been able to kind of find ways to win, grind it out on both ends of the floor. So, you know, we'll see if they have another big game in them. But, you know, yeah, I don't usually like changing my picks, right? So I'm going to keep, you know, the Knicks pick. You know,
Yeah.
obviously, like we've talked about some of the picks that we had were wrong, but, you know, I don't, you know, still, I feel like the Knicks are going to probably end up pulling this out. I just don't know
100%.
if I'm going to trust Indiana in a do or die Game 7.
Yeah. That's exactly how I feel.
Yeah. And then, you know, obviously just, you know, one last point,
Sure.
not about the game, but just, you know, just kind of pointing out the draft lottery, right? You know, we had that, you know, last week, right? You
Yeah.
know, obviously the order of the lottery, not going to go through all of it, but, you know, obviously if you followed it, you know, some of the, you know, changes that happened, right? You know, the Hawks had a 3% chance, 10th best odds jumped up to 1, right? The Houston Rockets, right? I think they had the 9th best odds and they jumped up to 3, right? Detroit dropped to 5, right? Wizards dropped to 2. So, you know, interesting changes going on around there, right? Like we know with Atlanta, right? You know, they have some decisions to make whether or not they want to, you know, trade one of their guards like Trey Young or DeJounte Murray, right? What do you do with the number 1 pick? Who are you taking? You know, obviously, right? Houston, same kind of questions, right? Like, you know, who are you taking with that pick, right? Or maybe you move it, you know, for somebody. I don't know, right? Because there's a lot of, you know, negative feelings about the draft right now. So I think the thought process might be that having the number 3 pick in this draft probably isn't going to help you in terms of a trade as much as it might in previous years, right? Some have said like the number 1 pick in this draft or like number 1 and 2 would be like 7, 8 in another
Hmm.
draft, typical draft. The Homelander said thoughts on Bronny. I know in his first combine game, you know, he didn't shoot well, but I know he, you know, did some other stuff. And I think in this last scrimmage or whatever, he played much better.
Yeah, he had
Um,
like 14 points. I think 4 for 10 from the field. My memory might
right.
be Cruz, but or 4 for
Yeah.
11 or something like that.
Yeah. So I think there's a world where he'll probably where he could be a better pro than he would be as a college player, just because like in the NBA, his asks are probably going to be a lot different, right? Like obviously he's, you know, what, like 6'2" or whatever. You know, but you know, he could probably be, you know, like some type of 3-and-D guard. And then maybe if he improves, you know, on some other skills, maybe he could be like, you know, like if he improves his ball handling, you know, or something like that. Maybe he could get you some, you know, offense at different points, but you know, he'll probably still be a, you know, a player that can help a lot of teams, right? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know where he's going to go in the draft, right? You know, because there's a lot of questions right now on, you know, which team is going to take him, right? You know, do you take him? Maybe does that swing? What happens with LeBron? We don't know. Are the Lakers going to take him? We don't know. But I think he can still help a lot of teams, and that's kind of the theme with this draft for the most part, right? Is that like there's a lot of players where even though they may not have superstar potential, franchise player potential, they can help out a lot of teams, right? Like your team, Oklahoma City, right? The Homelander, right? I think they have the 12th pick, right? So obviously, if they wanted to, I guess they could trade it, or you could take, you could use that pick and bring in, somebody, that could help out. Maybe you bring in another big, right? Maybe you bring in, some other, taller, athletic, guard, something like that. Um, so but as for the Bronny point, like, I think he'll be like a solid player. Like, I don't know what his ceiling is going to be, right? Because it's kind of difficult to, gauge that, right? Because, it's a little bit easier, I think, sometimes to gauge the ceiling of the higher level picks.
Yeah.
But I think at worst, like, he could probably be like a decent rotational player for most teams because as long as he can shoot and defend at a relatively decent level, which seems to be his, strengths and skill sets, he's going to get minutes, right? Because,
Yeah.
like, that's what a lot of teams are looking for. Keep the pick, to be honest. Yeah, like if you're Oklahoma City, like I just don't know what you're gonna get with the 12th pick. So it's like,
Keep it. I agree.
yeah, like if all it's gonna get you is like just another random mediocre role player, like you might as well just use the pick and take somebody else, right? Obviously, we'll see what they do, but
Yeah.
it sounds like even people within the NBA are pretty low on the superstar potential in this draft. So if you're just not going to get a lot for that pick, you might as well just keep it and then just be like, you know, maybe it could like if you had, let's say like you had the 12th pick or whatever, and let's just say like it's a playoff series, that could be the Gordon Hayward spot, right? Or, it could be the Josh Giddey spot or something
Right.
like that. Or it could be like a backup big spot or something like that, right? Like it would just be another guy you could have in your rotation that's probably better than what you have on the team right now. Or could be better within the next few years.
Yeah. And the way that I've kind of heard people talk about this draft is, the best player in this draft could be a toss up. It could be the number 1 pick, it could be the 15th pick, heck, it could be the 30th pick. You never know who the best player in this draft is going to be, and that's, I think, the beauty of it. But that's also the danger of it because there's a lot of guys with a lot of potential. But in regards to like the trading stuff, I feel like the only people who are really going to be trading picks are people who are either going to be looking to move down or up in this draft. That's kind of the way that I think it's going to go. I don't foresee a lot of people, exchanging a lot of picks for a lot of personnel unless it's the number 1. Because I do know that a number 1 pick has a lot more value, I think, than the rest of them. Obviously, that's why it's the most coveted pick. But there's just nobody really in the draft that screams number 1 pick. And that's the problem I think that the Hawks are probably going to face, and other teams that probably want to move on from their draft picks, and maybe pass on it. Who's really going to buy in on it? That's the real question.
Yeah.
But yeah, the
Like
lottery has been very interesting. We've seen a lot of good stuff from the combine as well, but it really just all comes down to fit and what these executives want to do.
right, like yeah, like if you're a team like Oklahoma City or even a team like Memphis, right, who we know is a good team but just had a ton of injuries, right? Like you're not crying over having the 9th or 12th pick because that could just be another decent player to add to the rotation, right? Where it's probably rough is if you're a bad team and you have a high draft pick because, the people in this draft are not what you would love to have, in this draft, right? Like say, your team has the number 2 pick, you still could take somebody good, right? But, obviously, it would have been nice to have the number 1 or number 2 pick last year.
100%.
Um, right? Because the guys at the top were better, right? But you also just never know because any one of these guys, like you said, could be the best player in the draft. And even some of the guys at the top could potentially be even better than what people might expect. You just never know sometimes with the draft. It's always a crapshoot sometimes where, there are guys that people expect to be good that are good. There are guys that people expect to be not so good that aren't so good. But then sometimes there's also the opposite, right? Where somebody looks good but doesn't pan out, or somebody looks bad and then all of a sudden, is significantly better than people expected. So that's kind of the funny thing with the draft. But like you said, if teams trade like the picks in this draft, it's cough, cough James Wiseman. My goodness.
Oh,
Um, but
ooh,
but
the
that's the
shade
thing is
is
that like
real.
but that's the thing is like, like you said, if you trade a pick in this year's draft, it's probably like you said to move around, right? Like let's say if a team's trying to trade for Donovan Mitchell, I don't think Cleveland's going to be excited about, hey, we have like the 16th pick in the draft. Like, no, they're not going to care about that. They're going
Right.
to want future picks. But
Because the upcoming
then
drafts are there's some real talent and some crazy like generational stuff.
Exactly.
Well, we've hit, our hour mark. We're a little bit beyond it, but we came out with our picks for the series that are currently going on. And we appreciate everybody who showed up in this live stream. We appreciate you, Homelander. We appreciate you, James Wiseman fan. We hope that you guys can squash the beef off camera and all that stuff. Potential live stream tomorrow, if Denver does get the job done. But other than that, we will have our episode out on Friday as well. So please be on the lookout for that. And we will see you guys on the next live stream. Thank you for all the love and support. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you guys on the next one.